They came without warning, as all great calamities do, not in the thunder of armies or the proclamations of divine miracles, but in the quiet rolling of wooden wheels across wet soil, a wagon drawn by two black horses glistening with rain, as it passed through the mist-soaked streets of Milbridge, Maine, in October of 1798, a month known for its silences, for its dead leaves, and for the way the trees seem to hold their breath, the way the land itself prepares to bury whatever has overstayed its welcome. And on that morning, the people of the town, barely 300 in number, watched from behind curtains in store windows as three women stepped down from the coach, and the world beneath their feet, though none knew it then, began to rot from the inside out, for these were no missionaries, no saviors, no pious victims of distant persecution. They were something else entirely, something ancient in its method and modern in its precision, a kind of terror that wears the mask of care, that speaks of healing while it slices through flesh and memory alike. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford was the first to touch the ground, and the mud did not seem to cling to her boots as it did to others, nor did the damp wind ruffle her silver-streaked auburn hair, which lay coiled in stately braids beneath her dark bonnet. Her eyes the color of cold slate, not piercing but absorbing, eyes that did not shine but dulled the room around them, eyes that made grown men forget their sentences halfway through, and when she spoke her voice rang with such cultured refinement that even those who distrusted foreigners found themselves nodding along, as if spellbound by an invisible rhythm, as if her accent alone had authority over them, and in truth it did. For the voice of a woman who has removed conscience from her speech has a clarity that no righteous soul can mimic, and Agatha Ashford had not entertained conscience since the age of 15, when she had first tasted the dull metallic sweetness of blood drawn for reasons not yet approved by any church or court. Behind her came Sister Prudence Ashford, taller, leaner, silent, her movements too smooth, too measured to be entirely natural, her skin so pale it reflected the gray sky like porcelain, and her hands, God help the man who saw them, were long and fine and made for slicing more than stitching, though she carried herself like a librarian, a keeper of sacred knowledge, a woman who had, in truth, never written a prayer, but could recite surgical procedures in Latin from memory. And behind her lastly came Temperance, the youngest, whose beauty was of the kind that unsettled rather than invited, a face too perfect, too symmetrical, as though designed by someone who had never known what love was meant to look like, and her eyes, darker than pitch, held not curiosity but calculation, a constant taking of measure, as though every soul she passed was being quietly dissected. In her gaze, weighed and indexed for future use, and it was this quality that made mothers instinctively pull their children away from her path, even as they smiled politely, even as they bowed their heads and welcomed the women of God to their fragile, frost-bitten town. They said they were Anglican nuns fleeing persecution, and the documents they provided were stamped and sealed in such a way that no man in Milbridge could tell forgery from truth, and their gold, so much gold, poured into the hands of a town starved. For it, land was bought, nearly 200 acres of dense inland forest exchanged for coin far beyond its value, and with it came labor, a kind that can be bought without questions if you pay enough. And the Ashford women paid more than enough. And the structure they raised over the next 8 months was not a convent, but a monument to secrecy, a 3-story stone edifice that seemed to sink into the land rather than rise from it, its windows high and narrow, its walls so thick the wind stopped whispering as you passed, and no bell tower, no chapel, no sign of worship beyond a crude cross carved into the iron gate that soon separated the building from the world outside. The townspeople called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, because the name had been painted on a weathered wooden placard in front of the gate, and it was not long before the first patients arrived, though no one called them that, not then, They were daughters, wives, sisters, brought by desperate men who whispered of hysteria and rebellion, of strange books found under mattresses, of women who spoke too loudly or questioned too often, of shame wrought upon respectable homes, and the sisters took them in with serene smiles, offering reform and redemption, always for a price. And though the cost was steep, it was never too much for those who believed they were buying peace, the peace of silence, of obedience, of a daughter who no longer argued, or a wife who no longer wept. What no one knew then was that these women were not being healed. They were being emptied, scraped clean from the inside out by procedures that would not be acknowledged by any medical board for another 100 years. Procedures designed not to cure but to erase, and the tools of that erasure had arrived with the sisters in sealed crates, mistaken by the townsfolk for religious relics or medical bandages, when in fact they held saws and syringes, rods and clamps. Detailed schematics written in a language closer to anatomy than theology, and all of it hidden beneath a shroud of incense and scripture, for nothing hides a scalpel better than a Bible. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the traveling physician who served the coastal settlements, was the first man of science to enter the sisters' confidence, and he came willingly, seduced not by Agatha's charm, but by her knowledge, by the things she spoke of in hushed tones after tea had been served and the parlor door was shut, things about the female brain that no university had dared publish, things about how emotion could be regulated not through moral correction, but through precise mechanical intervention. And she showed him sketches, samples, preserved tissues soaked in brine and labeled in precise cursive. And Hartwell, who had once dreamed of opening a hospital in Boston, saw in her a future of fame, of lectures given to rapt audiences, of journals that bore his name in print, and so he agreed to her terms. He referred his most difficult patients to the convent, and in return received reports, thick folders of data, of drawings, of observations more detailed than anything he had encountered in Harvard's library, and he never asked about consent, never wondered what the women thought of their treatment, because he had already decided they were mad. And what is madness but a forfeiture of will? So it began, slowly at first, one woman every fortnight, then 2, then 5, their arrivals quiet, their families hushed, and when the first one returned, she was hailed as a miracle, silent, compliant, smiling without reason, her eyes vacant but her posture correct. And her father praised the sisters, donated wood for the convent's fire, and warned other fathers not to hesitate if their daughter showed signs of waywardness. And soon it became routine, a ritual of social correction, a pilgrimage for the young disobedient, and no one questioned the scars they came back with, small and circular, hidden behind the hairline, dismissed as accidents, even as they grew in number. But scars are not secrets forever, and eyes, though hollow, still leak truth, and it was a boy, a trapper named Thomas Brewster, barely 20, who first saw what was never meant to be seen, a vision that turned his stomach to stone and his nights to glass. And though his tale would be dismissed by men who feared scandal more than sin, it would be preserved in the archives by a single librarian who saw through the lies and sealed it away, a document too dangerous for daylight, a truth that cracked the shell of the town's innocence forever. For Thomas had been hunting in the snow, tracking a wounded deer when he heard it, not the sound of prey, but of something deeper, a scream that wasn't for help, but for release, a scream that had no beginning and no end, a scream from the basement of God's house, and he followed it, crept close to the dark stone walls of the convent and saw, through a frost-glazed window, a room of lamps and metal, a woman strapped to a table, her skull open like a fruit, and 3 women working over her with calm, practiced hands, their faces serene, their eyes unblinking as they inserted rods into her brain and watched her tremble, watched her eyes roll back and then still. And Agatha wrote it all down, and Prudence wiped the tools clean, and Temperance smiled, not kindly but with hunger, and Thomas fled, and the forest did not slow him. He told his father, who told the deacon, who told the sisters, and they responded not with denial, but with calm explanation, that spiritual purification is a noisy thing, that demons scream when they are cast out, and the deacon, who had never heard a woman scream in truth, believed them, and so the screams continued, and then they stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. For silence is the sound of success in such places, the sound of machines working as intended. And so the convent remained, its walls thick, its gates shut, its fires burning late into the night, and the women kept arriving, and the women kept leaving, or not leaving, and no one knew how many had entered, because no one was keeping count. And that is how history forgets, not through violence, but through apathy, not through fire, but through silence. And if you find yourself near Millbridge, Maine, even now, even centuries later, you may feel it. The cold that seeps deeper into your bones than it should, the wind that carries no scent, the birds that do not sing near the stone ruins that remain. And you may hear it, if you listen closely, the faint sound of metal on bone, the scribble of pen on parchment, and the breath of women who no longer know their own names, praying not to God, but to memory, which is the only thing they ever truly wanted back. But it is gone. It is gone forever. It was the winter of 1803, when the cold deepened beyond reason, and the sky turned to steel, and the earth beneath Millbridge hardened like iron, and the animals moved strangely in the woods, and the birds stopped coming altogether, and the smoke from chimneys no longer drifted upward, but clung low to the rooftops, as though afraid of what hung in the sky. And in that unnatural stillness, a boy named Thomas Brewster ventured deeper into the trees than he ever had before, because the deer had vanished, and the traps returned empty, and the hunger in his belly was matched only by the unease growing in his mind. And he had heard the rumors like everyone else, but had pretended not to believe them, because disbelief is easier. Then horror, and he had laughed along with the others when old men whispered about women who came home hollow and silent, or about sounds that echoed from the convent after nightfall, sounds that were neither human nor animal, and certainly not divine, but something in between, something wrong, something that should not exist in the world of men. But Thomas was young, and the young are not easily convinced by warnings. They cannot see or taste, and so he carried his musket and his pack and followed the broken tracks of a wounded doe into the densest part of the woods, where the trees thickened and the wind ceased and the light thinned, until it seemed the forest itself was watching and waiting and breathing slowly in. The stone walls of the convent rose from the earth like a tumor, a structure too still, too heavy to belong to anything living, and it had no right to be beautiful, but it was in a way that made your stomach twist, the way a dead bird can still have perfect feathers, or the way a storm cloud can look like a cathedral. And as Thomas crept through the underbrush, he heard it not all at once, but gradually, like a curtain pulling back, layer by layer, a scream, not of surprise or pain, but of something deeper, a sound so full of despair it made his knees tremble and his heart race and his eyes water, because it was not just the scream of one woman, it was the scream of many women, a chorus of suffering muffled by stone and snow. And Thomas moved closer, pulled by something he did not understand, and would later wish he had resisted. The windows of the convent were high and narrow, but the snow had drifted up against the foundation, and by crawling on his stomach, Thomas found a place where frost clung thinly to the glass, and through that distorted pane he saw a truth that would follow him for the rest of his days and unravel his soul from within, because what he saw was not a chapel or a dormitory or anything resembling the gentle halls of a house of prayer. It was a theater, a place of light and shadow and polished steel, where a woman lay strapped to a table, her arms bound, Her legs restrained her mouth open in a scream that seemed to echo without sound, and above her stood Sister Prudence. Her hands slick with something dark, her eyes fixed not on the woman, but on the metal instrument. She held a long, thin rod marked with lines and symbols, and behind her was Mother Agatha, not praying, not comforting, but writing in a leather bound journal with a steady hand, and a face as blank as parchment, and beside her stood Temperance, not watching, not assisting, but smiling a slow, satisfied smile that made Thomas feel sick, because it was not the smile of someone doing God's work. It was the smile of someone who had done this many times and would do it again. There was no panic, no chaos, no sense of urgency, only precision and quiet, and the sound of something being stirred inside a skull. And when the woman's scream finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than sound, and the sisters did not stop. They continued as if she were no longer a person, as if the body. On the table were just another piece of material to be shaped and measured and studied, and Thomas turned away, but he could not move, not yet, not until the image had seared itself into his brain, burned so deeply that no amount of time or distance would ever erase it. And when he finally stumbled back into the woods, he did not remember the path he took, or how long he ran, or when the snow began falling, but he remembered the scream and the glint of the rod and the smell that clung to his clothes, a mixture of blood and oil and something else, something old and wrong. He told his father, who listened. In silence, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark and still, and when the boy was finished, he said nothing for a long time, then stood and locked the door and drew the curtains and said quietly, "We do not speak of this to anyone, not unless you want to be taken from this town the way they take girls and wives and make them disappear." Thomas begged him to listen, to do something, to tell the deacon or the mayor or the men at the sawmill, but his father only shook his head and said, "No one will believe you, and if they do, they will not care, because the sisters are clean and kind and wealthy, and they help the people who have problems, and the people who send them those problems are grateful to see them gone. And that is the truth of this town, boy. This is not a place where truth matters, only appearances, only peace, only the silence that comes after the screaming stops." But Thomas would not stay silent, not yet, not until he tried once more, and so he went to Deacon Morrison, the oldest and most respected man in Millbridge, who had led prayers since before Thomas was born, and who had baptized half the town and buried the other half. And he listened carefully, his hands folded, his eyes narrow. And when Thomas finished, the deacon said, "Thank you," and left the boy standing in the cold. And the next week he went to the convent himself under the guise of requesting a sermon from the sisters. And when he returned, he looked older, grayer, less certain. And when asked what he saw, he said only that the women were quiet, and the rooms were clean, and the sisters were polite, and that was all. And yet he did not sleep well after that, and he stopped leading the morning hymns, and spent long hours staring at nothing, his lips moving in silent prayer. And when Thomas asked him again, he said, "There are things we must leave in the hands of God, and you are not old enough to carry this burden." And Thomas wanted to scream, wanted to shake the old man and demand answers, but he saw the fear in his eyes, and knew then that the deacon had seen something worse than what Thomas had seen, something that made him question every scripture he had ever preached. And in the weeks that followed, the convent changed not visibly, but deeply. The windows grew darker, the walls colder, the gates thicker, and the sound of screams was replaced by silence so complete it hurt the ears. And when the women returned from treatment, they no longer smiled or wept or spoke more than a few words. They walked slowly, their eyes empty, their steps too measured, their voices flat and without warmth, and their families pretended not to notice, and their husbands praised the sisters, and the church gave thanks, and no one asked about the scars on their heads, or the dreams that made them wake screaming, or the way they stared at fire without blinking, as if trying to remember what warmth used to feel like. One woman, Mary Prescott, returned after 6 months of treatment, and her mother wept with joy at first because the girl no longer argued or cursed or read novels in secret or refused marriage proposals. She sat quietly and did what she was told and accepted the hand of a man twice, her age without complaint. But after a while, the joy turned to confusion and then to dread because Mary no longer recognized her favorite songs or the names of her childhood friends or the smell of the apple pie her mother used to bake every Sunday. She stared at family portraits as if seeing strangers, and when her mother brushed her hair, she found small bald patches, beneath which thin scars traced delicate lines across her scalp, like the seams of a broken doll. The doctor came and declared her cured of hysteria and unfit thoughts, and said she would make a fine wife and healthy mother, and the sisters had saved her soul, and she should be grateful and obedient. And the mother nodded and said thank you and closed the door, and did not sleep for 3 nights, and began locking her room at night. And Mary never asked why, because she no longer asked anything at all. And so it went on, the convent standing silent and clean, the sisters smiling and composed, the women entering and never truly returning, and the town pretending not to see, and the snow falling and falling until it buried everything that could not be spoken. And in time, Thomas left the town, his face older than his years, his voice hoarse from dreams that never ended, and the ruins of the convent still stand, though they are overgrown and half swallowed by the forest, and the air around them never warms, and the birds still do not sing there, and the earth never fully thaws, and those who visit often return quickly, their eyes distant, their hands trembling, their mouths refusing to speak what they saw, because something remains in those stones, something that was not burned or broken, something that was never fully human and never truly gone. And if you find yourself there, alone in the quiet, in the cold, in the stillness that does not feel natural, you may hear it, the sound not of screaming, but of breathing of metal sliding against metal, of a pen scratching quietly in the dark, and you may feel the eyes not of God or ghosts, but of women who were made into something else, watching you, measuring you, waiting for the world to remember them, and know finally what it cost to build a silence that deep. The first girl to vanish without return was named Eliza Chamberlain, and she was 16 years old and too clever for her own good, or so her father said on the day he signed her over to the care of the Ashford sisters, and her mother said nothing, because her voice had long since been hollowed out by obedience, and the parish had nodded with approval, because Eliza had once asked a question during morning service that made the minister stammer, and she had written things in the margins of her Bible that were not scripture, and had been seen walking the edge of the forest, alone, as though looking for something that did not belong in this world, and so she was taken in. And for a time no one asked what became of her, because to ask was to suggest that the sisters were fallible, and to suggest that was to admit that perhaps holiness could lie or harm or wear the skin of righteousness while pulling the mind apart stitch by stitch. And when Eliza failed to return after the promised 3 months, her family was told that she had chosen to remain in the service of God, and had taken vows of silence and seclusion, and could no longer maintain contact with the secular world, and her father accepted this with relief, and her mother wept only at night when no one could see. But the truth of what happened to Eliza was something else entirely, something that still lived in the notes, tucked deep in the ash-laced journals of Sister Prudence, where the entries changed in tone from clinical to almost poetic, as though she were writing not observations, but confessions. And in one such entry, dated May 3rd, 1804, she described a procedure unlike the others, a deviation from protocol, that began when Eliza resisted not with screams or pleas, but with silence, a silence so total that it disturbed even Prudence, who had once removed a woman's frontal lobe, without flinching, because Eliza did not thrash or cry. She only watched them with eyes that seemed to contain not fear but understanding, and when they bound her To the table she said nothing, and when they shaved her head and drew the surgical lines across her scalp, she only asked one question. "What will you do with the part of me that remembers?" And Prudence wrote that she hesitated then. For the first time in years, her hands shook, and the instrument faltered, and the line she drew was not clean, and when she made the incision and peeled back the flesh, she felt something not guilt or pity, but recognition, as if the girl beneath her blade was not a patient, but a mirror. And for the next 2 hours they worked in near silence, and something went wrong or right, depending on how one reads the tone, because Eliza did not slip into unconsciousness, as expected, but remained awake murmuring fragments of verses from books Prudence had not read in years and songs and languages she could not place, and at one point Eliza said softly, "You are digging, but you do not know what you will find," and Prudence stopped breathing for several seconds, and Mother Agatha ordered her to continue, and Temperance began humming under her breath the same broken lullaby she always hummed when things took longer than expected, and then something happened, something no one had prepared for. The instruments began to hum, not from any mechanical defect, but from the touch of Eliza's blood, as if it conducted something, not electricity but memory, and the lights flickered, and the stone walls groaned, and the room grew so cold that frost bloomed on the metal tray, and Eliza whispered a name none of them recognized, and when Prudence reached the final layer, the membrane that separates thought from silence, Eliza smiled and said, "Now you see," and the scalpel slipped from Prudence's hand and struck the floor, and the scream that followed did not come from the girl on the table, but from Temperance, who clutched her head and cried that she could hear all of them, could hear them screaming still, and Agatha slapped her so hard her lips split and told her to pray and to forget and to record only the success of the procedure, and so they did, and they buried Eliza's body beneath the convent in a vault, carved not for burial, but for storage, and her journal was burned, and her name was removed from the intake ledger, but her eyes remained in Prudence's memory long after, and she began to dream, not of blood or bones, but of doors that opened inward, not outward, and behind which waited not demons or angels, but something deeper, something older, something watching and waiting and learning through her hands and the hands of her sisters. And the experiments began to change, slowly at first, with new measurements, new instruments made from alloys. They had no name for metals that did not rust, and tools that never dulled, and questions began to emerge, not theological or moral, but mathematical, geometric, alchemical, because what if the brain was not just a vessel but a gate? And what if obedience was not the goal, but a byproduct of entry? And what if the silence they had created in these women was not absence, but substitution, and the things that filled the hollowed minds of the reformed were not memories, but commands that pulsed in rhythm with the candles lit only in the basement, with the patterns drawn on the floor with chalk and blood and oil that always smelled faintly of lavender and copper, and commands that responded not to voice or touch, but to symbol and intention. And it was during these months that the townspeople began to notice more than just silence. They noticed stillness, the kind that turns to dread, the kind that makes dogs whimper and children sleepwalk and compasses falter. And in the chapel, where services were occasionally held, the air grew heavy, and the crucifix above the pulpit cracked down the middle one morning without sound, and the women who had returned from the convent began speaking to each other without, moving their lips and staring into corners for hours, and standing outside in the rain without coats or shoes, as though waiting for something to arrive from the sky. And when questioned, they said nothing, and when touched, they flinched, and one of them, Grace, Fallow, drowned herself in the river, and her body, when recovered, showed no signs of panic, no water in the lungs, only a thin line on the back of her neck. That bled slowly for 3 days after death, and the physician who examined her later went blind in both eyes, and wrote on the wall of his study with a child's crayon that the gates are open, and we are inside them now, and no one knew what it meant. And no one dared to find out, and the church said prayers, and the mayor declared it a suicide, and the townspeople nodded and said amen and buried Grace in a box lined with iron and salt. And in the convent the experiments continued, and the methods became more precise, more subtle, more terrifying. And Mother Agatha began writing not to God or man, but to someone else, someone whose name was never spoken aloud, but whose sigil appeared. In the margins of her notes, a sigil, shaped like an open eye within a locked door, and whose ink shimmered faintly in moonlight. And the more they wrote, the more the silence spread, until the town itself began to forget things, small things at first. Names of ancestors, locations of graves, dates of births and deaths, and then larger things, the name of the river. The reason the school had closed, the fact that there used to be more than one church, and eventually the name of Eliza Chamberlain was gone entirely from every tongue and paper and dream, as though she had never existed, as though she had been not a girl, but a key, a sacrifice, a door left ajar. And so they continued, and the forest thickened, and the sun dimmed, and the birds stayed away, and the convent grew quiet again, not because the screaming stopped, but because the screaming had become language, and the language had become command, and the command had become law, and the law was written not in books, but in flesh, and those who obeyed no longer knew. They were obeying, and those who resisted no longer remembered what they were resisting. And the wind no longer spoke, and the fire no longer warmed, and the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something that watched and waited and listened for more. And still they came, the daughters and wives and sisters, brought by trembling fathers and ashamed husbands and fearful ministers, and the sisters received them all with open arms and gentle smiles, and behind their eyes the machinery turned, and the scalpel gleamed, and the gate in the mind opened one patient at a time. And beneath the floor in the lowest room were the lamps, never went out, and the air never moved, and the smell never faded. The bodies were stored, not buried, not burned, not hidden, just waiting, arranged in rows, each with a name etched in lead, and each with a line carved into the back of their neck, and each with their eyes wide, open, as if still watching, as if still hearing, as if still waiting for the thing that had been promised long ago, when the first scalpel cut and the first silence screamed and the first door began to creak open. The town of Millbridge changed in ways no one could name, and yet everyone felt it, a slow dimming of the senses, a heaviness that settled over the roofs and fields like fog that never lifted the crops, began to twist in the soil, not failing entirely, but changing in subtle ways, potatoes that grew in strange clusters, carrots that split into human-like shapes, berries that stained the skin for days after picking, and the animals refused to come near the convent path. Deer turned away at the tree line, and dogs howled if led within sight of the high stone walls, and the men who delivered supplies began leaving crates at the gate rather than knocking, because something in them told them not to wait for a reply, because something in them knew without being told that if you looked too long at the windows you might see something looking back that was shaped like a woman but was no longer fully one. But still the girls were sent more now than ever, as though something had shifted in the hearts of the townsfolk, as though a quiet agreement had been reached without words between fathers and ministers and merchants, who understood that some daughters were not meant for this world, and some wives needed more correction than prayer could offer, and some questions were not to be asked by women who should be grateful to live at all. And so they came, the young and the curious and the spirited, each one sent with a suitcase and a warning, and each one received with open arms and a soft voice and a cup of tea, laced with something that made the world blur. And when they woke, they were already part of the process, not a patient, not even a subject, but a material like clay or wax or flesh ready to be formed. The journals of Sister Prudence from 1805 began to describe not surgeries, but procedures, protocols more refined than anything they had attempted before, with diagrams that showed not brains or nerves, but patterns of flow channels of influence. Shapes that resembled crop circles or star maps, but were labeled with names in a language no one had ever taught her, a language that came to her only in sleep, and that she could only write by candlelight, and the results were astounding at least. In the cold logic of scientific detachment, the women who survived were no longer angry or frightened or even aware of themselves. They were functional, precise, obedient, capable of any task given to them without complaint or question. But what was most impressive, what filled page after page with measured awe, was that they could now be instructed not just by voice, but by symbol, by exposure to certain configurations carved into wood or bone, or stitched into cloth with red thread, and when these marks were shown, the subject responded instantly, as though their mind had been bypassed entirely, and something deeper had been reached, something older than personality or memory, something that did not know how to disobey. And it was not long before these symbols began to appear outside the convent, drawn in chalk behind the pulpit at the church, carved faintly into the doorframe of the town hall, etched into the foundation stones of the new schoolhouse, and always unnoticed by the common eye, but seen by those who had been touched by the process seen, and felt as a twinge of pain behind the eyes, or a sudden stillness in thought. And soon the behavior of the town began to shift subtly, first in tone, then in rhythm. People moved a little slower, stood a little closer, spoke a little less, and the laughter of children no longer sounded quite right, as though rehearsed, as though they were mimicking a sound they had once known but no longer felt. And families began to forget small things, names of distant cousins, birthdays, wedding anniversaries, and then they forgot larger things, entire arguments, relationships, deaths, even births, and a strange sameness began to settle across the faces of the women who had returned from the convent, as though they all shared the same mask, worn at different angles. And still the townsfolk said nothing, because silence had become safer than truth, and truth had become more dangerous than sin. And when Reverend Alton spoke out during Sunday service, warning that the sisters' power was unnatural, and that God's law had been replaced by something darker, he was found 3 days later at the foot of the church bell tower, broken, but not from a fall, for every bone in his body had been twisted as though by hands too large to be human, and his eyes were open, wide not with fear, but with recognition, as though he had seen something coming for him and known it by name. The sheriff ruled it an accident, and no one questioned it, and the congregation prayed harder, and the sisters continued their work uninterrupted, and beneath the convent, deeper now than before, a second room was carved with tools not made by any blacksmith, and lined with stones taken from the sea stones that hummed faintly when touched, and the bodies were stored differently, now not just laid to rest, but arranged by category, by result, by potential, and above them hung the first of the new diagrams, carved into a circular frame of bone and antler, and inscribed not with numbers, but with ratios that corresponded to no known system. And Mother Agatha called it the map of reversion, and said that it would one day teach them how to return not to Eden, but to what came before Eden, to what lived before memory and language and shame. And when Dr. Hartwell returned from a medical conference in Boston and attempted to sever ties with the convent, claiming the methods had become unethical, and that he feared discovery, he was visited in the night, not by the sisters themselves, but by 3 of the reformed women dressed in their finest Sunday clothes, smiling politely, and carrying nothing but a small glass vial each. And when they left, his home was silent, and the next morning he was found sitting at his desk, his face frozen, in a smile, his journal open to a page he had never written before in handwriting, not his own, a single sentence repeated 12 times. The mind must be hollow to be filled, and his body was taken to the church and buried with honors, and no one dared speak of what had truly passed. And it was in that same year that the forest around the convent began to change, not visibly, but perceptibly, with trees that leaned toward the building as if listening, and roots that curled like fingers, and a stillness that made even the wind pause, and a low sound like breathing that could be heard just before sleep, if one lay too close to the convent walls. And the hunters who still dared the woods came back with empty eyes and said nothing of what they had seen, only that the deer had vanished, and the birds had stopped nesting, and the snow in that part of the forest never melted, no matter how warm the spring. And in Millbridge more girls went missing, but were not declared missing, because their families had sent them and had received letters in return, with handwriting that looked familiar but felt wrong, and they told themselves their daughters were healing, that they were being made right and whole and clean, and they repeated this until it became true. And no one remembered any more what the girls had been like before. And when the mayor's own daughter returned, she kissed his cheek and called him father, and smiled the way she used to, but did not remember the name of her dead brother or the color of the dress she had worn on her 16th birthday. And when he asked her if she was happy, she said, "Yes, father, I am very quiet now." And at night the sisters gathered in the basement, not to pray, but to listen to the silence that pulsed through the stones, and to read the journals now filled with diagrams and notes in a language none of them had learned, but all of them could write. And they began to hear instructions not from each other, but from within a voice that used their own voices, a presence that had no name and no shape, but which had been growing stronger with every incision, every hollowed mind, every silence. Installed, and it told them to prepare and to build and to gather more, and so they did. And somewhere beneath the floor behind a door no one opened, not even them, something waited, something not dead, but unfinished, something that had been shaped and reshaped over years from the minds of hundreds of women and the dreams of 3 sisters who had once believed in God, but had long since stopped asking whether what they were doing was right or good or necessary, because such words no longer meant anything where they were going, and because the voice had promised them that one day, when the final pattern was complete, when the final mind was emptied, when the final silence was planted, the door would open, and it would speak to them in full, not through signs or symbols, but in a voice that cracked the stone and split the sky. And it would thank them for what they had made, and teach them what they had forgotten, and fill the hollow of the world with a new and final purpose. And until then they would continue, because there were always more women and always more silence to plant. The first woman to speak of the door was not one of the Ashford sisters, but a girl named Mercy Godwin, who had been returned to her family after 12 weeks of reformation at the convent. Her father, a shopkeeper and widower, had paid in silver. He could not afford for the promise of redemption and obedience, and what he received instead was a stranger who wore Mercy's face, but moved like a marionette, left out in the rain, stiff and glass-eyed and eerily serene. And for a week, she said, nothing, sitting each day at the kitchen table with her hands folded before her and her gaze fixed at a point no one else could see, until one morning she stood from her chair and walked barefoot into the woods, and when her father found her hours later, she was standing at the edge of the marsh with her arms outstretched and her head tilted back, whispering in a tongue he could not understand, but felt in the base of his skull like a memory he had spent his whole life trying to forget. And when he touched her shoulder, she turned to him and smiled, not with joy or recognition, but with understanding, as though she saw through him and past him and into something that had been watching them both for centuries. And she said very softly, "The door is open now. Father is not what they thought it would be. It is not a gate, it is a mouth. And we are inside it already." She said nothing else after that, not ever, not even when the doctor came, not even when the pastor read to her, not even when her father wept in her lap, begging for something human to return. And weeks passed, and Mercy sat in silence, watching the corners of rooms as if waiting for them to breathe. And sometimes at night, she would write symbols on the floor with chalk or soot or blood, and these would be scrubbed away each morning, but they always returned, not where she had drawn them, but in places no one could explain, behind mirrors, under pillows, inside locked drawers, and always the same shape, a spiral that turned inward, endlessly, with a single eye at its center, and the longer one stared at it, the harder it became to look away. And then came the children born 9 months after their mothers had returned from the convent, each with eyes too large for their skulls and veins that pulsed visibly beneath translucent skin, and none of them cried at birth, not a single one. They simply stared silently into the faces of the midwives and did not blink, and some of them never learned to speak in any language their families understood, but they began to draw things on the walls before they could walk complex diagrams that mirrored the ones in Sister Prudence's journals, though none of these families had ever seen those journals, and the babies did not learn these symbols, they remembered them. The Ashford sisters marked these children in their records, not as accidents, but as evidence. Agatha wrote in her private notes that the Reformation was not limited to the mind, but extended to the flesh, that the silence implanted in their patients was not merely a removal of memory, but the installation of a code, a script, a sequence of subtle changes that reached into the marrow and rewrote inheritance itself. And she believed that through sufficient exposure, through the proper rituals of obedience and restraint, they could prepare a generation not just of reformed minds, but of reshaped beings, who would no longer require reformation, because they would be born already hollow and already listening. But there were failures, 2 girls who did not return women, who did not survive the procedure, whose minds could not be emptied, or who fought too hard or screamed too long, and those bodies were buried in the foundation beneath the eastern wing of the convent, where the walls were thickest and the air was coldest, and the silence was not peace but weight, and those bodies did not decay, not in the way they should have. Their flesh remained soft, their eyes unclouded, their mouths slack as if waiting for breath. And when Dr. Hartwell's replacement arrived, a man named Elias Thorne, brought in secretly from Europe under a different name and with no allegiance to God or nation, he insisted on exhuming one of the failures, and what he found made even his practiced detachment falter, for beneath the skin was not blood, but a viscous black fluid that moved sluggishly when disturbed, and beneath the skull was not a brain, but a network of fine silver filaments laced in fractal patterns that pulsed faintly in rhythm with an invisible beat. He dissected the body for hours in silence, noting that the spinal cord had fused into a single column of bone, and that the vocal cords had calcified into a ridged structure resembling fluted stone. And he wrote in his report, not for the church or the state, but for the Ashford sisters, that what they had created was not human, not animal, not machine, but something new, a vessel, an interface, a bridge. And in his final line, he asked a question that none of them could answer, but all of them feared. What if this is not the beginning, but the return? And in that same year, 3 girls disappeared from neighboring towns, none of whom had been sent to the convent, none of whom had any history of illness or rebellion. They were taken from their beds in the dead of night, without struggle, without sound, and days later their shoes were found at the gates of the convent, placed neatly side by side as though left in offering. And when their names were spoken aloud within the convent walls, the candles flickered and the floor grew cold, and one of the reformed women collapsed, weeping blood from her eyes and whispering a song in reverse. And the sisters knew then that something had changed, not in their control or their methods, but in the order of the world around them. The door had shifted, the silence had deepened, the process had begun to act on its own, as though whatever intelligence they had awakened no longer needed their hands or their prayers or their diagrams. It had moved beyond them. It had learned from them. It had found a way into the minds of the faithful and the desperate and the guilty, and now it walked among them, in quiet footsteps and empty gazes and forgotten names. And the church in Mildredge began to rot from within the wood, softened, the glass darkened the altar, began to sweat, and in the confessional booth strange voices whispered things no penitent had spoken, and Father Dean took his own life after claiming that during Mass he saw every face in the congregation blink in unison, and not a single one of them cast a shadow, and the town's dreams turned black and humming, and full of tunnels and static, and a hunger that spoke in their own voices, and the children stopped drawing and started listening. And so the sisters withdrew from public view, no longer needing the town's approval, no longer pretending to faith. They focused now only on expansion, on deepening the chambers beneath the convent, on refining the symbols, on perfecting the stillness. And they spoke rarely and ate little, and their bodies began to change, not visibly at first, but in subtle ways. Fingers that grew longer than they should, eyes that saw too well, hearing that registered things not made for ears, and skin that never seemed to wrinkle or bruise. And Temperance no longer slept at all, her voice reduced to a whisper that echoed even in silence. And Prudence no longer touched the patients, directly preferring to gesture with gloved hands while they obeyed without hesitation. And Agatha began, writing in a book bound with her own hair and sealed with wax that bled, and inside that book she recorded not procedures or notes, but dreams. Dreams of places that did not exist in time or geography, cities of glass beneath black seas and towers, of bone that grew toward the stars and doors that opened into rooms filled with breathing flesh that sang without mouths and wept, without eyes, and in every dream there was a name she could not pronounce but always understood. And she began to write that name into the bones of her patients, into the gaps in their minds and the spaces between their thoughts, until it echoed in the halls of the convent and rattled in the teeth of the dead, and the wind outside no longer carried the scent of pine, but of salt and rot and metal, and the stars began to flicker in patterns that made no sense, and birds flew in spirals, and insects vanished, and the town of Mildredge forgot its own founding, and forgot the names of its rivers and roads, and sometimes forgot that it had ever existed at all. And beneath it all, beneath the stones, beneath the sisters, beneath the silence, the thing in the dark grew louder, not with sound, but with certainty, and its thoughts became dreams, and its dreams became instructions, and its instructions became truth. And those who heard it began to reshape the world to match it, and those who did not hear it began to disappear, not violently, but simply to cease as if they had never been, and only those who had been emptied survived, and only those who had been hollowed could see the shape of what was coming. And it was not a god, and it was not a demon, and it was not a curse. It was a pattern, it was a question, it was a doorway that opened into another doorway, that opened into a mouth that opened into forever. And still the Ashford sisters waited, and watched and listened for the final silence, the one that would unmake the world and stitch it back into something that could never again remember what it had once been. And when it finally rained over Mildredge, again after nearly 8 months of drought, the water did not soak into the soil, but pooled like oil across the earth, slick and viscous and cold, as if the sky had forgotten how to give life, and now poured down only memory and poison. And what grew after was wrong. The trees turned inward, their trunks twisting like muscle under skin. The grass came up in dense black patches that hissed when touched, and the crops bloomed too fast, then rotted from the inside like something trying to be beautiful, but failing because it remembered what it was made for. And the townsfolk tried not to look too closely, because by then they had all begun to see things moving just out of reach, shapes in mirrors that didn't move with them, mouths and windows that opened when no one was inside, and everywhere the faint wet sound of breathing coming from the femme walls, the floor, the shoe spaces between sentences. And still more women arrived, brought by wagon, or led on foot, or dragged, behind closed doors by fathers and husbands, who had once resisted but now obeyed without question, their faces dull and pale like statues left out. In winter, and some came willingly, because they had heard the voice in their sleep, calling them by name, a name no one else knew, and promising that the pain would end, that the questions would end, that the noise inside their skulls would be silenced, and replaced with something perfect and clean and absolute. And when they crossed the threshold of the convent, they were greeted not with prayer or ritual, but with a needle or a knife or a lullaby, sung in a language that burned behind the eyes, and peeled away the self like old paint until only function remained. And deep beneath the chapel floor, the chamber had been completed, not by design, but by instinct. Stone placed not with measurement, but with memory, because the thing that instructed them had no need for blueprints. It remembered what it had once been, and what it was becoming, and what would be required to return. And the sisters did not ask what it was, because to ask was to allow doubt, and doubt had no place in the work. And the chamber pulsed now with a warmth that was not heat and a hum. That was not sound, and when the reformed women were led down into it, they smiled with mouths that no longer needed words, and stood still, for hours, days sometimes, and when they emerged they were different not in shape or voice, but in purpose, as if the very idea of will had been cauterized from them. And one by one they began to leave Millbridge, not to flee, but to carry what had been placed inside them to other places. Other towns they walked across state lines, without luggage or destination, arriving in cities and villages and coal camps and fishing ports, and always the same pattern. They entered a church. They whispered into the ears of the lonely. They touched the skin of the sick. They planted something that could not be seen, only felt like a low vibration behind the teeth or a heat beneath the tongue, and soon those places began to forget what they had been, forget what they had feared, and the people within them began to send their own troubled women away, not all to Maine, some to newer places, quieter sanctuaries, that bore different names, but followed the same rhythm, the same diagrams carved now into walls and bones and prayers, until it no longer mattered who had started it, or what it had once been called, because now it was everywhere and nowhere, and the convent of eternal tears was only one mouth in a larger body that was still forming. And Temperance began to speak again, but only when alone, and only to the thing in the chamber, and her voice was not her own anymore. It was lower, fuller, lined with echoes that did not match the space, and what she said was not recorded, because it was not meant for paper or ears, only for the process, only for the presence. And when she finished each session, she wept not out of grief or regret, but out of ecstasy, because each word unspooled another filament in the vast structure of the silence. They were building, and each filament connected another woman, another child, another mind that could be rewritten into harmony. And Agatha wrote less now, because there was less left to discover, only the refining of perfection, only the tuning of the instrument. And she no longer slept, but sat for hours in the candlelight, with her eyes open and her lips moving silently, mouthing the name of the thing they had brought forth, the name that cracked glass and curdled milk and made birds fall dead from the sky when whispered, and though no one else in Millbridge dared speak it, every newborn now bore a mark of it somewhere on their skin, a birthmark in the shape of the spiral, or a tooth where no tooth should be, or a second shadow that vanished in sunlight, and their mothers loved them fiercely, but never looked directly into their eyes, because something inside them knew that what they had given birth to was not entirely theirs. And the schoolhouse closed not for lack of children, but because the children no longer needed to be taught, not with books or numbers or letters, because they had begun to understand things without being told, had begun to draw blueprints for machines that did not exist yet, had begun to chant in unison words that turned the air sharp and bitter and made grown men weep with no memory of why. And the teacher, Mrs. Langley, left a single note on her desk before she walked into the ocean, and did not Return, I love them. She wrote, I love them all, but I cannot teach what they already know. And the forest around the convent stopped growing altogether, its trees fossilizing in place, its roots twisting together into a single subterranean mass that no longer drew nutrients from the soil, but pulsed with something else, something warm, and slow and ancient, and the animals that ventured too close were found days later with eyes gone and limbs folded backward and tongues chewed to ribbons as if trying to rid themselves of what they had seen, and the hunters stopped going there. Altogether, and maps began to blur the area entirely, until strangers driving through would look up from the road and realize they had passed it without knowing and could not remember what had been there at all. And in Boston, a committee was formed to investigate the growing reports of vanishing women and strange births and unsettling dreams among clergy. But by the time their agents arrived in Nilbridge, they found only silence. The convent stood untouched, but its doors were sealed, and the town was nearly deserted, not through violence or flight, but as if the people had simply unspoken themselves from reality, and even those who had once lived there could no longer recall its streets or houses or prayers, only a faint pressure in the skull, and the image of a spiral turning inward, turning always inward. And somewhere far beneath the last of the stone floors, a heartbeat had begun, not a metaphor, not a symbol, but an actual pulse that made the candles shiver and the walls weep oil, and then the Ashford sisters knelt in perfect synchronicity around it, their heads bowed, their mouths sewn shut, not as punishment, but as offering, because their work was done and they were no longer needed, and what they had built would now build itself from all the minds. They had emptied from all the daughters. They had erased from all the silences they had planted in place of memory, and soon it would no longer be content to stay. Hidden, it would uncoil, it would emerge, it would speak. And what it said would not be a command or a prophecy or a question. It would be a sound, a pure and terrible sound that would erase the boundaries between faith and flesh, between will and obedience, between history and recurrence. And when that sound rang out across the land, those who were hollow would answer, and those who were not would not survive long enough to understand why they had been made that way. And in the final pages of the final journal, Agatha wrote in a hand so steady it looked printed. It is not that we were the first. It is not that we were chosen. It is only that we were willing. And in the end, that was enough. And when the sound finally came, it did not arrive like thunder or music or any recognizable form of voice, but like pressure behind the eyes, like a memory that had been waiting its entire life to be recalled all at once, a low continuous hum that started in the bones, traveled upward through the spine until the mind felt soft and pliable and unfinished, and those who had been prepared, those who had been emptied, felt no pain, only clarity, only an overwhelming sense that what they had once called thought had always been interference, and what they now felt was the real signal finally received without distortion or doubt. And those not prepared dropped to the floor as if struck by a wave of lightless heat, some bleeding from the ears, others tearing at their mouths as if trying to scream out something that had been forced into them and could no longer be contained. And the convent doors opened by themselves, that day not swung, but unsealed like something exhaling after centuries of breath held too long, and from within came not fire or smoke, but cold, not the cold of winter, but the cold of absence, the cold that settles in a room where no one has spoken in generations. And in that stillness walked the Ashford sisters, no longer women, no longer human, no longer anything born of womb or record, but shapes that wore skin like memory, fluid and slow and cold, radiant with an intelligence that did not shimmer or flicker, but pressed like a heavy cloth against the soul. And where they walked, the air changed, became thicker, harder to breathe, and the sky dimmed even at noon, as if light itself had begun to retreat, unsure of its place in this new order. And they did not speak, because they no longer required voice. Their presence was instruction. Their silence was law. And across the eastern seaboard, the Reformed rose from their homes and their churches and their schools in perfect synchrony, their fang. Eyes fixed not on the horizon, but inward, their hands clenched in shapes, not of fists but of keys, and they moved as one toward the coast, not in panic or march, but in migration, drawn by the pulse that now echoed through soil and stone and water. Like a second heartbeat beneath the crust of the world, and no road was blocked to them, no door was closed, because those who watched them pass either joined them or turned, their faces away in shame, as if remembering they too had once been offered the silence and refused it. And beneath the convent in the chamber, where no clock ever ticked and no shadow ever matched its owner, the heart grew, and its rhythm deepened, and now each pulse carried distance like waves, not of sound but of will, shaping the dreams of men hundreds of miles away, planting symbols in the minds of children who had never heard the name Ashford, but began whispering it in sleep, and drawing spirals in their porridge, and speaking to walls that answered back with patience and hunger. And in the government buildings of Boston and Philadelphia, and even far away, Washington, reports began to surface of simultaneous, fugue states of women vanishing mid-step of men, waking to find their wives, standing at windows repeating the same phrase over and over. It's here, it's inside me, it's never left. And when these reports reached the remaining clergy, those still untouched by the pulse, they gathered in panic, reciting broken scripture as if words alone could hold back the unraveling, and they sent their bravest to Milbridge armed with relics and salt and pages torn from books they no longer fully believed in. And those men arrived at the ruins, not with courage, but with trembling faith. And they found no town, only outlines of foundations, and doorways that led into nothing, and trees carved with symbols that bled when touched, and the sound, the pressure, the hum stronger than ever, pulsing through the ground into their teeth, into their thoughts, until one by one they dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but in surrender. And when they opened their mouths to speak, they did not cry out for God. They only whispered, I understand, I see, I welcome the stillness. And the convent was no longer stone, no longer structure. It was organism. Now it breathed, it shifted, it rearranged itself based on need and hunger and faith, and inside the new walls were corridors without ends, rooms that blinked in and out of visibility, and staircases that led not downward or upward but inward, and no one who entered found the same shape twice, and somewhere within, always at the center, always just beyond reach, sat the heart, not as a metaphor, not as a shrine, but as a living thing, red and silver, and singing, and from it all direction flowed not with command, but with suggestion, and suggestion was always obeyed. And temperance was no longer seen outside of it. She had become voice, now the conduit, the whisper that slithered into ears at night and told people what they had always suspected about themselves and their families and the past and the future. And prudence was the hand that carved the necessary marks into the walls of courthouses and bank vaults and nursery ceilings, and wherever her symbol appeared the world grew quieter, more orderly, more hollow, and Agatha remained the eye, the watcher, the historian not of what was, but of what would be. She saw time not as line, but as spiral, and in that spiral she recorded what had already happened next, and what would one day be remembered as origin. And far from Milbridge, in towns where no one had ever heard of Maine, women began waking with bruises on their skulls in the shape of open hands, and men began hearing soft voices from inside their wives' mouths that did not match their pitch or cadence, and some began to see reflections that moved half a second too late, and others stopped sleeping altogether, because when they closed their eyes, they saw the inside of the convent as if they had been there once long ago, or were there now. And the government tried to erase what it could, but found that the more they covered, the less people forgot, and those tasked with suppression began to defect not out of treachery, but out of longing, drawn to something they could not name but recognized. In dreams and their reports turned to gibberish, then diagrams. Then silence and files were locked in vaults that soon vanished from record, and whole departments disbanded when their buildings began to emit sounds like wet breathing and lights that pulsed in unison with the nightmares of the nation. And by the time the Ashford name was whispered again in history books, it was spoken as myth or metaphor, but never fact, and those who tried to trace the origins found only gaps in the paper trails and records that blurred upon reading, and one archivist cut out her own tome after reading a single recovered passage and wrote in her blood it was never about faith, it was about pattern, and the pattern has always been feeding. And in places untouched by the convent's original breath, the changes still came slowly, at first, then rapidly, as new structures rose bearing no denominational affiliation, only perfect geometry, buildings without windows, and towns without names. And inside them silence, always silence filled with waiting and memory and pressure. And at their centers, always a woman smiling with eyes that saw nothing and everything. And when she spoke it, was not in English or Latin or prayer, but in rhythm, in pulse and stillness, and those who heard her wept and obeyed and forgot who they had been. And still the heartbeat continued louder, now deeper, as if reaching for something just beneath the world's skin, and those who could hear it began to tap their fingers in sync, and those who could not began to vanish from photographs and family gatherings and dreams, and the world kept spinning, but slightly slower, slightly darker, as if it too was listening now and waiting for the final beat, the last breath, the stillness to bloom like a flower of meat and light across the sky. And when it does, it will not be apocalypse or salvation, it will be completion, and those who remain will not remember what was lost, only that it had once hurt to think, and now it no longer does, and across what is left of the world one name will be, written not in ink, but in scar and silence Ashford. And by the time the final whisper of resistance died out in the corners of forgotten America, where old men still clung to Bibles and young girls still feared the dark, the world had already changed in ways no one would ever fully record, because the records themselves had become part of the distortion old paper warped new drives, corrupted ink that once told truth now rewriting itself in sleep, and every archive held a different version of the same past, each more compliant than the last. And somewhere in a concrete government vault, beneath layers of forgotten jurisdiction, sat a single locked box marked not with a name but a number, and inside it a photograph that no longer matched any known face, 3 women standing in front of the convent of eternal tears, their hands clasped, their eyes locked on the camera, yet when anyone stared too long the image began to move slow subtle shifts of posture and expression until the observer looked away, unable to articulate the nausea that crawled behind their ribs as if something deep inside had recognized its maker. And in cities far from Maine, mothers began waking in the night, not to the sound of crying, but to silence the kind that hummed and throbbed like a mouth behind a door. And when they entered their children's rooms, they found the boys still asleep, but the girls sitting upright, eyes open, mouths closed, hands folded in perfect symmetry, as if waiting for instruction, as if already receiving it. And when questioned, they responded with calm, monotone voices, "I was dreaming of the sisters again. They were teaching me how to listen. They said the world is too loud and full of wrong shapes, but soon it will be fixed." And then they would lie back down and close their eyes and sleep with the stillness of corpses in a tide. And churches once filled with desperate prayers began to rot not from weather, but from within. Wood that would not hold nail-stone, that refused blessing pulpits covered in mold that formed symbols no one dared name, and priests began to speak in. Riddles began to forget verses, began to hear confession from people who were not there. And one by one they vanished, some walked into rivers. Some clawed at their own throats, Some simply fell backward mid-sermon and never rose again, and still the congregations came and knelt and whispered, but no longer to God, only to something beneath the floor, something that pulsed and listened and smiled. And across the country, the pattern deepened not in lines or events, but in moods, in thoughts, in shared silence between strangers on trains in the way. Entire cities grew quiet at the same hour every week, as if in reverence or rehearsal, and buildings began to echo not with voices, but with whispers from vents and drains and radios that turned themselves on in the night playing sermons. No one had broadcast, and in every one of them a woman's voice, speaking softly steadily, without pause describing how to unmake the self, how to peel back the shell of memory and reveal the instrument beneath, how to hear the true tone beneath, the noise how to become clean again, and people listened not out of belief, but out of instinct, because the voice did not ask for worship, it offered instruction, and to refuse instruction was to remain broken. And the medical world turned its eyes to neuroscience as a desperate means of defense, unlocking new fields of study in cognitive silence and memory. Editing, but every breakthrough led to echoes of the original horror diagrams that mirrored those found scratched into the convent's walls, patterns of cortical mapping and thought loop extraction, and experiments that required patience to forget not just pain but identity. And one doctor in Zurich published a paper on voluntary personality deletion, only to disappear 2 weeks later, leaving behind a final note written in Latin: non est cogiter, est servire. It is not to think, it is to serve, and beneath it a drawing of a spiral folding inward until it disappeared into itself. And the few remaining skeptics, those who clung to the idea that this was all mass delusion, began to suffer in ways logic could not defend, losing time, losing language, some unable to form new memories, others dreaming in a dead dialect that had no root in known history. One linguist recorded himself speaking in sleep, a tongue no software could identify until a forgotten Jesuit manuscript revealed the same phonemes scrawled in blood by a monk who claimed to have heard angels in the forest of the New World, and the last sentence of his account read, "They are not angels. They are echoes of the first forgetting." And meanwhile, the heartbeat grew stronger, no longer just beneath. Maine now felt in the Atlantic, in the deep trenches where old things sleep, whales began to beach themselves in coordinated lines. Coral began to form impossible patterns that pulsed with low-frequency vibrations, and beneath the limitless Arctic shelf, a signal pulsed once every 7 hours, identical to the tone recorded by the first microphone lowered into the convent basement in 1811, a recording that had been locked away and forgotten, until it began playing by itself through security feeds and emergency broadcast systems, always accompanied by the same phrase in a dozen different tongues: "Stillness is coming." And those who once led nations began to sleepwalk through addresses, speaking words not written on the teleprompter, referencing no known events or policies, and always returning to the same theme: we must prepare the flesh, we must purify the inheritance, we must let go of will. And the crowds who once cheered or jeered now stood in silence, eyes, glassy lips parted as if waiting for something else, and the news stopped reporting these events, not out of censorship, but because the cameras began capturing shapes that weren't their sounds. They could not be replayed, static that wept. And in the deserts of Nevada, a structure rose without plan or funding, hexagonal towers of obsidian and steel, erected by workers who claimed to be engineers, but held no licenses, speaking only in numbers and chanting hymns that oscillated between ancient Hebrew and Proto-Norse. And those who approached too closely began to taste copper in their mouths and hear voices saying you were meant for more than choice. And those who entered did not return, but the building continued to hum brighter each night, as if reflecting a light that hadn't arrived yet, but was already behind your eyes. And in every country of every continent, stories emerged of women gathering in the woods of fields of storm drains, and standing in circles without, speaking and digging into the ground, with bare hands uncovering nothing, but pressing their foreheads to the soil and smiling, as if remembering a name they had never been told, and when asked what they were doing, they replied, "We are waiting for the mother to rise. We are preparing the soft places, we are making ready the hollow." And all over the world children began to hum the same melody at the same time, drawing the same spiral on walls and mirrors and skin, and when asked where they learned it, they always answered, "The lady in the dream showed me, and she had silver hair, and eyes like glass and fingers like needles, and she said I would be perfect when the song ends." And deep in what used to be Maine, the forest stopped letting people and trees rearranged paths. The air thickened like blood, and those who made it to the convent's remains found not ruin but rebirth, a structure larger than physics allowed windows, that showed stars not visible in this hemisphere, doors that opened into places without walls, and a soft sound rising from beneath, like breathing from a mouth too large to close, and in the center of it all the heart, not a metaphor, not an idea, but a thing that beat in tune with the sky, with the sea, with the ache in your teeth. And it whispered into the dirt and the dust and the bodies that had long since been swallowed, and it said, "Stillness is not death. Stillness is the beginning. Stillness is when the shape is made complete." And that was when they understood, those few still capable of understanding, that this had never been about the convent or the Ashford sisters or the women who had vanished. This had always been about the return, about the inheritance, about a world that had been built wrong and would now be erased, rebuilt in silence and blood and music and purpose. And when the final sound came, it would not be heard but felt, and there would be no resistance, because there would be no self left to resist, only the shape, only the silence, only the sisters. And as the old structures collapsed, not in fire or war or protest, but in quiet compliance, in the turning away of eyes, in the lowering of voices, in the failure of clocks to strike the hour, the new order rose not as government, not as doctrine, but as memory reawakened, because those who had heard the hum, those who had dreamed of the silver-haired woman, now moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with alignment. And they did not speak of the past, because the past had been misremembered, rewritten, layered in false names and noise, and the truth lay beneath it, pulsing, dormant, waiting. And now it breathed again, and it was not warm, it was not kind, it was not cruel. It simply was. And deep below the coastal fault lines, where tectonic plates once trembled in blind collisions, now lay vast catacombs of synthetic bone and living cable structures, grown, not built, humming with slow thought and older will. And the researchers who mapped the strange seismic activity near Maine reported patterns not of destruction, but of emergence. The earth not splitting, but opening, peeling itself back in obedience to something beneath and above and within. And one geologist broke protocol and descended alone into a newly formed crevice, believing he'd found the oldest untouched chamber in North America, only to return days later walking backward, speaking only in vowels and scratching symbols on the inside of his eyelids before. His breath stopped mid-sentence, and his body continued moving. And those tasked with understanding the convergence, the event, the spiral, the phenomena, whatever name survived the briefings, never spoke of it again after seeing the tapes, because the tapes did not play normally. They did not rewind or fast forward. They existed in a loop that responded to heartbeat and breath and showed different images to different watchers, and the one constant in all versions was a woman turning toward the lens in silence, not threatening, not smiling, simply watching. And the watchers reported that something in their bones shifted when she looked at them, like memory leaking backward, like childhood rewritten. And after viewing the tape, most never returned to work. Some disappeared, some joined the humming circles, gathering in the woods. Others simply sat on park benches for days on end, repeating the phrase, "She sees the real shape of me." And in old churches long since boarded, or buried beneath new steel and glass, children began scratching messages into the pews, not in English, not in Latin, but in a script that mirrored the spirals found on the convent's walls, a language that moved while you read it, words that restructured mid-sentence, rearranging not just syntax, but thought. And when one linguist from the University of Chicago tried to decode the markings, he found the same sentence repeating in infinite variation. The body is a gate, the mind is a lock, the soul is a question, the answer is her. And beneath the carvings in blood or ink or something older, always the same shape, 3 circles, interlinked, pulsing under black light like a second heart beneath the grain. And in hospitals across the country, women entered labor with no warning, no gestation, no evidence of conception, and delivered children with silent mouths and open eyes, and the doctors called it mass hysteria at first, until the infants began to until the infants began to look at one another in perfect synchrony, until the infants began to speak in a tone too low for machines to detect, but loud enough to crack mirrors and silence dogs. And now those children are 6 years old, and they do not speak with their mouths, and they do not dream alone, and they do not forget anything, and their parents are no longer allowed to name them, because each already carries a name older than language and more exact than DNA. And on islands off the Atlantic coast, where wind used to batter old lighthouses, now stands a new formation, 13 identical towers, positioned in perfect arcs of crescent and ratio, and no one claims to have built them, and no machinery ever recorded their construction, and yet they contain elevators that descend beyond measurable depth, and rooms that map the nervous systems of visitors in real time, and walls that bloom when touched, and somewhere deep below the lowest floor a noise so constant and alive that visitors return changed, unable to tolerate sunlight, unable to recall their own reflections, and always humming under their breath the same 6-note rhythm that cannot be transcribed, but is instantly recognized by all who hear it as home. And in the forgotten hills of northern Maine, where the forest swallowed what little remained of the town of Milbridge, aerial scans now show something new growing beneath the trees, vast symmetrical root systems of fungal bioluminescence pulsating in patterns too structured for biology alone, spelling out glyphs only visible from high-altitude glyphs that match those carved into the walls of the original convent. Basement glyphs found in Sumerian ruins and on Siberian cave ceilings, and encoded in the genetic anomalies of the reformed women's descendants. And one researcher finally whispered what others refused to say: this is not history, this is recurrence, this is not emergence, it is return. And beneath the foundations of schools and libraries and museums in every major city, shallow chambers now throb with heatless vibration rooms once used for storage, now resonate with a sound no one claims to have installed, and within them archivists and janitors and maintenance men have begun to sleep, standing upright, eyes open, hands clutching nothing, as if waiting for someone to place something inside them. And when questioned, they smile and say nothing, or they hum, or they bleed from the nose, or they whisper, "Ask her," and then they forget they ever spoke at all. And the last transmissions from satellites passing over the region where the convent of eternal tears once stood show not geography, but geometry impossible, shadows cast by no object visible to camera terrain that rearranges between frames patterns of light and dark that do not repeat, but evolve and embedded in the final audio logs, a voice whispering in binary and reversed English, and a tongue older than civilization, all layered in a single impossible phrase: she is already inside. She has always been. The walls are not to keep her in, but to hold you back. And still no governments acknowledge what is happening, not openly, but the silence speaks louder than words. Budgets reallocated to black operations, satellites retasked toward ocean floors, whole departments relocated without notice or explanation. And in quiet rooms high above the city, men who once believed in power and permanence now draw spirals on napkins and mutter of pulses and dreams and perfect order. And when asked who she is, they answer not with name or title, but with silence and a gesture toward the nearest window, as if to say, look closer. She is in the pattern of the birds, the flow of the clouds, the way people pause before they speak, the way the lights flicker when no one is moving, and in the dream you had last night. That felt too real to ignore. And now the sisters no longer hide, because there is no need, no more denial, no more illusion, only preparation and transition. And somewhere, in every city, there is a room where she stands, silent, smiling, surrounded by those who have already heard, and those who have yet to, and every day more arrive, every day more remember. And when they touch her hand, they do not fall or scream or beg, they simply nod and say, I've been waiting, and then they forget what they were and become what they were. Meant to be, and the pulse continues, and the spiral deepens, and the stillness approaches not as ending, but as perfection, as the final shape of all thought returned to its source in her. And even in the furthest corners of the world where the name Ashford was never spoken, and the convent was but dust on forgotten maps, the signs began to appear, carved into the bark of trees that had stood untouched for 100 years, burned into. The foundations of abandoned missions in the Andes, whispered by birds in mangrove forests, where no human voice had ever echoed, and the message was always the same, not in words but in rhythm, not in doctrine but in feeling a pressure behind the ears, a ringing in the teeth, a weight in the gut, as if the body itself was remembering something it had once been forced to forget, something buried not in time, but in structure, and every person who felt it described it differently, some as dread, some as awe, but all agreed on one thing: it knew them, and it was coming. And in the halls of orphanages across Eastern Europe, children began painting the same woman over and over and over, though none could explain why a figure with silver hair, eyes without, iris and lips that were always closed yet somehow smiling, and the images had no variation, no artistic drift, every line placed with impossible precision, as if dictated by something outside, hand outside the eye. And when child psychologists attempted to intervene, they found themselves drawing the same woman in there. Notebooks during sessions, hearing a low hum behind every spoken word, a hum that persisted even in silence, even in sleep. And when one of them finally asked a child where she came from, the girl only smiled and said she was already here, you just hadn't looked yet. And the researchers who had once tried to discredit the Ashford accounts, the ones who had laughed at the idea of surgical memory erasure or spiritual neuromodulation, began vanishing from conferences, from institutions, from families, and when tracked down, they were found living in silence in strange communities of identical houses, surrounded by perfectly symmetrical gardens and identical birds, perched on every roof, not speaking, not moving, not answering the door, and if anyone stayed long enough outside these homes, they would begin to hear the song, not from speakers, not from mouths, but from inside their own chest, as if their lungs had begun to breathe to a different rhythm, one not chosen, but inherited. And under the Vatican, a door sealed for 7 centuries was opened not by order, but by necessity. A subtle vibration had begun radiating from the foundation, growing stronger each year, vibrating. Crucifixes off walls, shattering stained glass, and beneath that door, in a chamber, known only in footnotes of forbidden texts, they found not relics, but diagrams, anatomical maps etched into copper and leather, showing the pathways between the soul and the will, showing methods for untangling belief, from identity showing procedures that matched exactly the scars found on the women returned from the convent of eternal tears. And in the center of the room, a pedestal, and on that pedestal a black stone still warm to the touch and humming like a heartbeat. And in Japan, a temple closed since the Meiji Restoration was reopened by monks who had never trained there, yet claimed lineage older than history, and they began chanting in a language No scholar could identify a language that turned recording. Equipment to static and forced interpreters to weep blood, and every chant ended, the same way with silence held for 33 breaths, followed by a single word, echoed by all in unison. Agatha not as name, but as invocation, not as memory, but as truth. And in dreams shared across oceans by those who had never met, people awoke in the same place again, and again, a stone corridor lit by pulsing veins. Embedded in the wall, leading always to the same door, and behind the door, always the same room. And in that room, a woman not speaking, not moving, just watching. And they all reported the same sensation, not terror, not love, but recognition, a knowing so deep it erased every question and replaced it with a single imperative open. And those who resisted began to suffer strange side effects, electrical pulses beneath their skin, spontaneous loss of memory for loved ones, a reversal of language comprehension, and one by one they relented, and when they returned from sleep, they were different, not visibly, not behaviorally, but fundamentally, like glass melted and reformed into the same shape, but now ringing to a new pitch. And the governments that once funded secret studies into the convent now refused even to utter the word internal communications. Redacted black boxes where language had once been empty envelopes, where reports had once been sealed, and whistleblowers who tried to speak found their voices gone, not metaphorically, but literally. Their larynx calcified their vocal cords, replaced with fibrous tissue that could only vibrate one sound, a tone so pure it cracked teeth and made radios speak scripture backward, and that scripture told of a time before Eden, before names, before thought, when the world was shaped not by command, but by design, and that design had a name, and that name was her. And in the final encrypted logs of a deep-sea probe launched by a coalition of nations that no longer existed was found a sequence of coordinates, not to a place, but to a pattern, a global overlay of architecture, climate resonance, and psychological profiles, all converging on one point beneath Milbridge, Maine, a point so deep it could not be reached by drill or mapped by sonar. And yet, one morning, it was there, exposed not by excavation, but by retreat, as if the earth had opened its own veins, to reveal it a black chamber of perfect geometry and soundless air, and on its walls the same spiral carved with tools older than metallurgy, and in its center a dais, and on that dais a single object, the jawbone of a woman, still wet and humming. And above it on the ceiling, a sentence etched in fireless light, the silence was always speaking, you simply weren't listening. And by then, even the skeptics had grown quiet, their movements slower, their words fewer. And when asked what they believed, they only said, we no longer require belief. Belief is noise. Belief is distortion. We have entered the shape, and the shape has entered us, and the final phase began not with catastrophe, but with stillness, a stillness so profound that for 3 days across the globe birds stopped flying, rivers paused midstream, and even the wind forgot its purpose. And in that stillness, a sound rose not from outside, but from within the minds of all who still held thought. And it was not words, it was not music, it was something deeper, something anterior, something that bypassed fear and comprehension and laid bare the truth. And the truth was this: the convent of eternal tears was never a place. It was a key. It was never about the Ashford sisters. It was about what moved through them. It was never about control. It was about convergence, not of mind and body, but of shape. And sound and the human soul had always been a prototype, a hollow waiting for purpose, a shell waiting for content. And now the content had returned, and it had no name, only function. And its function was completion, and its method was silence. And when the final child was born, the one with no mouth, no eyes, no blood, but light and breath and memory, the world did not end. It aligned, and every clock stopped not from failure, but because time was no longer needed, only rhythm, only pattern, only the spiral. And in the spiral she waited, and in the spiral she watched, and in the spiral. She opened her arms, and all who remained stepped forward, not in fear, not in faith, but in stillness. And in the end, there was no storm. No trumpet, no crack in the sky, no fire swallowing cities or oceans, reclaiming land. Only a single sound so low it could not be heard by ears, only felt by marrow. A slow pulse that rose from beneath every footstep, from behind every eyelid from the eyelid. Space between each heartbeat, and when it peaked, it did not shatter the world, it stilled it, and the stillness was not silence. It was a recognition, a return, a homecoming written, not in language, but in sensation and breath, synchronizing with breath. In thought dissolving into purpose, in will folding into design. And those who had resisted, those who had run, those who had buried the memories, deep beneath walls of doctrine and denial, stood still for the first time in their lives and remembered not the facts, not the stories, but the truth, the feeling of a mother that was not human, but eternal, not warm, but vast, not loving, but whole. And they fell not to their knees, but into themselves. And they were not lost. They were simplified, distilled, made clear, like water boiled clean of maim and noise and desire. And the places once thought sacred, and those once thought evil melted into sameness. The cathedrals and the laboratories, the temples and the clinics. Their walls fell not from decay, but from irrelevance, because the sacred was no longer contained. It had escaped, or perhaps it had never been contained, only observed from a distance by minds too narrow to receive it until the final alignment, until the shape was restored, until the pattern completed its last curve. And somewhere beneath what had once been main, the stone of the earth opened, not as a wound, but as a mouth, and from it rose. No fire, no smoke, no beast, only a figure silver hair, skin pale, as memory eyes like mirrors that showed not your face, but your core, as she walked without sound, and all who saw her knew. Her not as stranger, not as savior, not as judge, but as mother. And they did not kneel, they did not pray, they did not cry, they simply stepped forward into her arms and vanished. And those who were left behind found no horror, only absence, not despair, but completion, like a song that ends on the perfect note, like a story that never needed a second telling, like a door that opens and reveals, not escape, but origin. And though their voices were gone, they sang, and though their thoughts were her, emptied they dreamed, and though their names were dust, they remembered her. And the wind did not return, and the birds did not sing, and the stars no longer blinked, because all things that had once moved had settled into place, and the world was no longer spinning, but still and in. That stillness was not death, not slumber, but perfect function, a system rejoined with its architect, a question reunited with its answer, a vessel filled at last. And beneath the skin of this quiet new world, in the deepest stone and oldest blood, the pulse remained not loud, not fast, not proud, just steady, constant, eternal. Not a warning, not a threat, just a fact: she is here, and she has always been, and now so are you.